Hello everyone, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're here in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium of the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Reminder that next week is Veterans Day, next Wednesday, and MDH is again partnering with the Daughters of the American Revolution, Mississippi Veterans Affairs, and the Mississippi War Veterans Memorial Commission to honor Mississippians who serve and have served in the United States Armed Forces. That free public program will begin at 10:30 on the Entergy Mississippi Plaza in front of the museum, so please join us for that. And then join us next week as well for History's Lunch when Keisha Blaine, author of the new book, Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America, will be joined by Jackie Hamer-Flakes and Mr. Charles McLaurin. Looking forward to that. Today, we are delighted to welcome Stephen M. Monroe to present Old South Rhetoric at Southern Universities. Monroe is assistant professor and chair of the Department of Writing and Rhetoric at the University of Mississippi. He earned his BA in English from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga and his MA and PhD in English from the University of Mississippi. His first book, Heritage and Hate, Old South Rhetoric at Southern Universities, has just been published by the University of Alabama Press. Help me welcome Stephen Monroe.
Thanks. Thank you for being here. One of the things I write about in this book is the small world of Mississippi. And Barry and I were talking about how when two Mississippians meet for the first time, if you eavesdrop on them, and it's always a good thing to do, they'll play the name game. And within just a few minutes or a few sentences, they'll have made multiple connections. So we've got a very big state in terms of geography, but a very small state in terms of people. And Deidre and I played the name game, didn't we, Deidre? She was the first one here, and it's amazing how well that works still. So that's one of the things I cover, and I feel like now I've built my network by meeting most of you. Thanks for being here. Also want to thank Chris and everybody at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for hosting me. I don't love public speaking, but when Chris reached out and made this invitation, I jumped at the chance because it's such an honor to be here with you all and in this facility, which I think is just a jewel of our state. Also need to thank Dan Waterman, my editor at the University of Alabama Press, Clint Kimberling, and all the other great people at the University of Alabama Press. I do not root for the University of Alabama football team, but I love the people over there, and they've been just fantastic. Also understand the series is underwritten by the folks at the Shackelford Charitable Fund, so I wanted to thank them. And of course, all my colleagues, students, friends, and fellow alumni, many of you all are in the audience are alumni of the University of Mississippi. So this is my primary case study, and I am an insider of sorts. I've been at the university for 21 years, and I love it very much. I'm not entirely objective in that sense. And in some ways, when you read the book, and I hope you will, you'll notice that this is a critique of the University of Mississippi. And I try not to flinch as I'm thinking about the place in all its complexity. But in other ways, it's a book that's a long reflection, a positive reflection on the university's past, present, and future. I try to spend some time thinking about how we can get better as an institution. For those of you who did not attend the university, I also write about the University of Georgia, University of Alabama, a lot of other big universities in the South. Raise your hand if you have some connection to the University of Mississippi. Great. Okay. So I skewed my talk a little bit today toward the university, thinking that might be the case. But there's a lot of examples, a lot of stories from other universities in the book. And I am a believer in the institutions of higher education, higher learning that we have in Mississippi and around the South. And you know, they're wonderful places, complicated, sometimes confusing, even when you've been on campus for 21 years. They're multiracial institutions that are struggling with racist histories. They're very, very conservative institutions full of progressive people. And for me, they're truly fascinating and inspiring places. And this university has inspired me the most. So in the book, I try to better understand these communities, these very important communities, in the U.S. South by putting words and symbols front and center. And you can see here, this is an excerpt. I believe in the deeply intertwined nature of language and identity. By analyzing certain artifacts of public memory at these schools, in the book, I show how words and symbols have churned actively above and below the surface of the South's conflicted history. And my long argument is that Confederate rhetoric, Old South words and symbols, that I think a lot about in the book, have consistently performed cultural and ideological work during moments of crisis and during quieter periods of peace. So as a scholar of rhetoric, and I think I had a couple of questions about rhetoric coming, I'm intrigued by how we as humans argue with and about words and symbols. And then two, by the ways in which those words and symbols influence our individual and communal identities. So for me, words and symbols catalyze action. They make history. One example, Confederate statues. Here's the Confederate statue before it was removed from the center of our campus. And in the background of this fuzzy picture, you can see the Lyceum back there that I showed in the first image. So when I think about Confederate statues, I think of them as very loud and reverberating rhetorical bell towers, arguments from the past, racist arguments that are sounding today throughout our society and that are broadcasting messages from the past. I'll give you an example that I heard just last week from a friend of mine in Oxford, Rose, who's older than I am. She's an African-American woman in Oxford. And she has told me that when she drives through town, she often avoids the square, the Confederate statue on the square, because it disturbs her. It sends a message to her every time she passes it. And as a white person, I don't get those same messages. And so what I do in the book is listen and try to document moments like that. Here, we see a really inspirational moment from the University of Mississippi. Two students, that's Curtis and that's Tyler, carrying the Emmett Till memorial that had been shot up over at the river, at the Till site. And they, on this night in October of 2019, after a panel that was sponsored by the Emmett Till Commemoration Project, decided on the spur of the moment at dusk to walk the shot-up marker, which had been brought over as a visual aid for the panel, across campus. And it was a hot night, and they were sweating. Curtis cut his hand on one of these shards here. And they walked the marker over to the Confederate statue and stood in a silent protest. It was a really powerful moment. Susie Altman was there. She's a photographer here in Jackson, and I encourage you to go to her webpage and see these very powerful images from the night. And I write at some length about this moment in the book. And I would also encourage you to read the essay that Curtis wrote, Curtis Hill, that was published in the Clarion Ledger and other places. It was a rhetorical masterstroke, in my opinion, as they created this tableau in protest. And it was one moment in many moments of argument over that statue within our community, and it was my favorite moment, I think. Curtis was in my class and is just an extraordinary person. And it's an example of how we argue with symbols and about symbols, and it's a great story, and it's in the book. So arguments over and through Old South words and symbols tell us so much about ourselves. And a few of us were talking earlier about how complicated Mississippi is. And this whole facility is devoted to better understanding Mississippi. Another example that I spend a lot of time discussing and thinking about in the book is the term Ole Miss. So Confederate rhetoric, as I explore it, can often be obvious. So the Confederate statue is an example of very obvious Confederate rhetoric. But it can also be less obvious and can sometimes hide in plain sight. It can become commonsensical, just something we don't even think about, and almost unquestionable. It can just become a part of our universe. And the term Ole Miss I would put in that second category. And I spent a full chapter of the book learning, because I did not know, learning about the very complicated history of that term. And I traced the long and complicated history, but I also provide highlights of moments when the term had great consequence. And I start that chapter with these two dueling epigraphs, two quotes from the same year from two very progressive leaders on our campus. One, the chancellor at the time, Dan Jones, and the other, a distinguished professor of history, Charles Eagles, who's probably talked here before. And if you haven't read his books, I encourage you to do so. And here you see in the same year, the chancellor of the university saying, "I love the words Ole Miss. The affectionate term Ole Miss is an important part of our identity and will continue to be," on and on and on. And in the same year, you have Professor Eagles saying, if you bill yourself as Ole Miss and you call yourself the Rebels, and the first thing a visitor sees is that Confederate monument, it conveys an image. And if he could do one thing, the place would never be called Ole Miss again. This conflict, which is not often talked about, is present and has been for a long time. There are a few people bold enough, like Professor Eagles, who's not a shy person. He's a very bold person, who have been willing to speak out. It's easier for a white person, I think, to speak out about this. But on campus and within the community, there is a larger and quieter group of people that are dissenting in silence, and that have now decided to not use the term and to instead always use the longer term University of Mississippi. In the book, I tell lots of stories about these folks who are not supporters of the orthodox practice. One is Jackie Certain, a colleague of mine. She was a great advisor at the university, has helped thousands of students over the years. And Jackie Certain, her great-great-great-grandmother was an enslaved woman in Lafayette County and happened to be interviewed by the WPA folks when they were interviewing former slaves. And Jackie got a hold of her relative's interview, and I reprint it in the book. But during the interview, her great-great-great-grandmother, Polly, referred to the white woman that she worked for, even after slavery, as her Ole Miss. And she did it several times. Jackie told me that before reading that, she had always had reservations, quiet reservations about the term. But when she read her relative's narrative, she decided right then and there to never use it again. And she decided to always work not for Ole Miss, but for the University of Mississippi. So it's a really interesting conflict, and in the book I talk about this group of quiet dissenters who avoid the term. And it is absolutely unresolved and something that will define us in part for the future. I also tell the story of Chancellor Jones and what can happen to university chancellor when a large group of stakeholders believe that the chancellor is attacking the term Ole Miss, which he did not do. Oddly enough, he was defending the term Ole Miss, but folks got so riled up and started petitions and Facebook initiatives. We were talking about Facebook earlier, to hashtag Fire Dan Jones. And that timeline is fascinating. It's a really interesting bit of history, and I tell that story at length in the book. As I mentioned, Confederate rhetoric can sometimes be overt and obvious. Here's the Confederate battle flag in 1962. This is an image from a photographer who was working for AP. It can sometimes be hidden in plain sight, like the term Ole Miss, or it can really be hidden below another layer or two. And I was very surprised to learn, as I was researching the book, 7 or 8 examples, moments from history when our hotty-toddy cheer, which is normally used in very positive contexts in very positive ways. Sometimes now when 2 University of Mississippi graduates get married, they'll do the hotty-toddy. Often used in very positive ways. It's a fight song. It's a really good way of conveying our hatred to the University of Alabama football fans, for example. But as a person interested in language, I was fascinated to find that cheer or fight song has often or regularly been used by white students against black students as a racist jeer. And so this takes up a whole chapter. I try to understand how this happens and why this happens. And I tell the stories in the book. It's a seemingly benign packet of language. If you know the hotty-toddy, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, there aren't profound ideas in the cheer. There's some funny stories. There were throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There were really polite people who refused to use the cuss words in the cheer and would change it. So, an example, my son, when he learned the cheer as a part of his preschool on campus, you know, what are the last words of the hotty-toddy? Anybody remember? By damn, right? Oh, I shouldn't have said that. I think I'm on Facebook Live. Hope my mother, I hope she's not watching. Well, so when they teach it at the preschool, they teach it as by or yes ma'am. They replace by damn with yes ma'am. and my son, he was like 12 before he realized that he had been lied to. It was kind of a Santa Claus moment, you know. So I tell stories like that in the book and try to understand how this seemingly benign language has been used in really hateful ways at critical moments. And one of those moments was in 1962 when James Meredith, as you all know, came to the university, and there was this riot and upheaval, and you all know the history. Well, a small part of that history, as reported by Curtis Wilkie and Charles Eagles and Ed Meek, and then an FBI agent or two, is that the action of the night kicked off with the hotty-toddy cheer. And in fact, throughout the event, at various points, students and perhaps others on campus used that cheer, making it not more polite, but far less polite and hateful in various ways. this really surprised me, and I found 7 or 8 moments in history when that has happened, including in 2012 when President Obama was reelected. I might need to look that up. I think that's the right year. When there was a conflict on campus that night, and in fact, white students used the hotty toddy cheer late at night against black students. I also think a lot about how Confederate rhetoric can be disrupted. You know, we're all in Mississippi and we're making progress. And it's up to all of us to try to improve the state and to come together and to improve racism, which is one of our legacies. And that's what this entire place is dedicated to. So I think about if words and symbols have contributed to racism, how have words and symbols, how can they be used to continue fighting racism? And one of my arguments is we have to find ways to revise problematic words and symbols, and this work is happening, of course. And I offer lots of stories and ideas in the book. This is one of my favorites that I thought I would share with you. Ralph Eubanks. Y'all know Ralph Eubanks? Great Mississippi writer. And this is from his book, Ever is a Long Time. And it's a story that he tells about coming to the university in 1974. And he was assigned a white roommate. There weren't many African American students then. And, you know, his dad is moving him in. And he gets to the room, but his roommate was there first, and he opens the door and he sees this giant Confederate flag hung up as decor, which was a very mainstream thing to do. But it bothered him immediately, of course. And his dad pulls him aside and said, "Look, Ralph, I know this is bothering you, but you're gonna see this everywhere. And if you're gonna make it, you're gonna have to get used to it." A very difficult message for a father to give a son. Well, they unpack and they go to lunch, and by the time they get back, his roommate, Mark, had taken the flag down because he recognized that it caused hurt. And Ralph remembers that his roommate said, "I didn't want to offend you with the flag." That's a good story of an interruption of racist rhetoric, and it's a very simple example. I offer lots of others in the book, some from more recently. But I see these moments, these examples, as clear roadmaps for broadening hospitality, fighting racism, and for making our universities, which are incredibly important institutions, more welcoming for 100% of our students. If you get the chance, read Ralph's book, Ever is a Long Time. All right, I really appreciate you listening, and I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. I know we have a really erudite audience. I tried not to be intimidated by the introductions. Y'all are so smart and accomplished. I'll open the floor, and if you have a question, raise your hand, and Chris will come around with the microphone.
I was over at the reading room, Professor, at the archives, and I typed in as a subject, rhetoric, and I think I got 9 hits. And most of them were about literature, you know, and I think the subject heading was something like rhetoric, and then in parentheses it said narration. So what I was wanting to ask you is, what's the difference between rhetoric and narration, or, you know, used in literature or in history?
Sure, yeah. I'll stick with quickly defining rhetoric. How about that? And this is a question on Saturday. I was working, I try to pitch in and do my best for the University of Mississippi. So I was working one of these big recruiting fairs, and maybe some of your children or grandchildren were up in Oxford. We have them in, and we feed them, and we give them a tour, and then we have browse fair tables. And I was in front of the rhetoric table, and it's a great conversation starter, because 12 times, usually a dad would stop and say, "What is rhetoric?" And I would, "Hey, let me tell you, come on in." And so anytime we use words or symbols as humans to convince or persuade other humans of something, that is rhetoric. Over the centuries, there have been lots of other definitions that are more complicated than that, but persuasive language is the way I think about rhetoric, and for me, it's a very broad concept. So an example, like the one I gave in the presentation of the statue, that statue is broadcasting an argument, although not really broadcasting a clear story. So it's almost everything it can be rhetorical, and it's not as simple as the way, and this is probably always true, politicians oversimplify it, right? Do we have any politicians in the room? Okay, good. I don't want to offend a state leader today. But you know how it's used in politics and the media. Oh, that's just rhetoric. We actually have the opposite conception. If it's rhetoric, it's incredibly important, because it is language being used to convince or persuade someone of something. And it's the stuff that history is made of. Historical events don't happen until people are moved to action. And words and symbols move people to action. Other questions?
Yes, with the growing backlash to what's called critical race theory, it looks like the state legislature may be acting in a manner that might undermine the objective teaching of race relations. Is this a concern at Ole Miss now, or is there any pressure at all that there could be a clash between legislative action and freedom of instruction?
Yes. So I would say there is concern, but from my experience, we have academic freedom, and I've felt no pressure from above to change what we do. In the media, there are misconceptions about what folks in higher education do or try to do. As colleagues, my colleagues, we don't try to convert anyone to anything, ever. What I'm interested in the classroom is getting students to think outside the box, to write, to read, to become better as speakers and writers. And if they end up becoming politicians, I'll still be proud of them.
I wonder if you don't mind saying a few words about Mississippi State University, if you've done any research into that.
I've never heard of that one. Where is? That's in Starkville. Okay, I'll admit something if you promise not to tell, and then Chris, maybe we edit this out for the YouTube. I like Mississippi State. Okay, it's a great institution, and people in Oxford don't want to hear that sometimes, and so I have to. But we actually have good relations between the two universities. It's just that one Thanksgiving day, right, that we really hate each other. What better day than Thanksgiving to hate, So it's a great school, and it's funny, and I talk a good bit about Mississippi State here, and I went over one day, my son had a baseball tournament in Starkville, and we went to campus and toured campus, and he has been raised in Oxford, and of course, learned the hotty-toddy in pre-K. And about 20 minutes in, he turned to me and he said, "Dad, I thought this was a terrible place. It's actually kind of nice." And so I took that opportunity to teach him about objectivity, right? You're going to learn different things wherever you are. But that day I found and photographed the statue of Stephen Lee right at the very center of campus. And I had never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. And went home and did a little research and found that there really hasn't been much controversy about it, a little bit, but not nearly as much as has been made about the Confederate statue that we have now moved on our campus. And so I have that photograph in the book. I tell the story of Stephen Lee, and I don't make many predictions, but I do gently predict there that will become controversial at some point in the future. And so, what this book does not do is it does not argue, which sometimes we hear these arguments, that Mississippi is alone, or that we are the only state with problems or racism. It does not say that the University of Mississippi is the only major school in the South that is has to deal with the issue of racism. And so I look to Mississippi State and other schools for examples, and they're easy to find. I regard the U.S. South as a hyper-linguistic place. It's a place where words really matter and have always mattered to people of all levels of education. And so rhetorical artifacts litter the ground. They're everywhere. And certainly that Stephen Lee statue at the center of campus at Mississippi State is a good example. Yes? Oh, the microphone.
I know in Oxford particularly, it's hard to separate the university from the college town Oxford. So I was wondering if you could speak to any rhetoric that happens off of campus, whether it be with businesses or local government, that might contribute to students and faculty or people who work at the university, and how those can kind of play off of each other.
Well, it's true. I mean, town and gown relationship in Oxford, it's pretty good compared to some college towns. We've got a mayor right now and we've had quite a few mayors who cooperate with the university chancellors, and so the relationship overall is really strong, in my opinion. But they're two very different places or institutions. And Oxford has about 25,000 people. Somebody check me on that. And then the university has about 20,000 now. So when our students come to town, it really almost doubles the size of the place, and it probably triples the trouble, I would say. But also the fun, triples the fun too. So they're different, and they are moving at different paces in this regard. The Confederate statue that rose avoids on the square is still there, and may or may not be moved anytime soon. The one on campus that you saw Curtis and Tyler protesting has been moved. It's still on campus. It's not a perfect solution. It's an ongoing story. But at least it's been moved from the center of campus. It no longer welcomes visitors in the way that it did when Professor Eagles was writing in 2014. But they're very, very different. And certainly economic considerations play a part in all of these things. You might go and look at what Uncle Ben's Rice did recently. They changed to Ben's Rice and produced a video that was really smart and nice and interesting, in my opinion. I'm not a spokesperson for a rice company or anything, but you should go see the video on YouTube. And it's a reminder that anytime words and symbols move people positively, as many of these Old South words and symbols still do, that they can be commodified and used to sell products, T-shirts, flags, beach towels. Remember driving down to the beach in the 80s and seeing the beach towels for sale? I always saw rebel flags as part of the display. So, I think business has a role to play. Big business is there. I don't know about Mississippi businesses that have jumped in and that are progressive in quite that same way. Might be happening, probably is, but I don't know.
Do you cover in your book the black universities in Mississippi and any icons that are associated with them?
Yes, so I focus in my book on predominantly white institutions, and mainly because that's where I find the problems. And I do tell some stories of black protest and resistance, and those are incredibly inspirational stories. But what I'm focusing on in this book is what can predominantly white institutions do now to make things better. And lots of other good books have been written, but my book focuses mainly on PWIs, or predominantly white institutions, big schools that are in rural settings, like Oxford or Tuscaloosa or Athens, Georgia.
How about Southern? Is there anything on campus there that you talk about in the book?
I don't get to Southern. Can you think of something that maybe I can write about next? Will you send me an email?
But you do talk about, as you say, in the book, a lot of institutions out of state. University of Missouri, I think, has some interesting.
Spend a whole chapter on Mizzou, and anybody that says these words and symbols don't matter should look at the recent history at the University of Missouri. They've gone through crisis after crisis, and it's been extraordinarily consequential to that flagship university. I also spent some time looking at high schools. There are lots of high schools around the South, and y'all can think of some, that have adopted rebels. Some of them have even had the Colonel Reb, the flags. And so I spent a few maybe 5 or 6 pages looking at examples like that of Old South words and symbols that have spread. For a long time, of course, as I hinted at when I was answering your question, this was a good strategy for bringing people together and rallying folks, right? When an institution is all white in the 1940s or 50s, this works. This worked well as a uniform, as a rallying cry. The big problem is it was racist, and so these things still exist, and in spots, even not just within the South, but I found examples in California. There's a school in Anaheim that was the rebels, and they had a big rebel soldier statue and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I deal with institutions large and small in the book.
A couple of years back, my wife and I went and toured Greenwood and all the sites that were used in the help. Then we took a little road north out of Greenwood, and first we crossed the bridge where Billy Joe McAllister jumped off, but it was a different bridge. But anyway, you go up about 5 more miles and you hit a cemetery. There's a plaque to Robert Johnson in one of the 3 cemeteries that all claim that he's buried there. You go about a couple of more miles and you get, and I forget the name of the town, and you get to where they had the plaque for Emmett Till. I guess that's the one that keeps getting desecrated, but what I saw them carrying in that picture looked to be much larger than what I remember. They just had one of those standard plaques there. Now, have they improved that plaque over the years in some way to make it less susceptible to danger? Do you know?
Well, yes, sir, and they have changed the plaque, but it keeps getting shot up. You can see here bullet holes, and the part of this story that I was telling y'all the inspirational part about our university students. A few months prior to this, and I tell this story in the book too, 3 of our white University of Mississippi students posed by that plaque with their guns. And it was a late night situation. They had their guns, they were smiling, they posed with the plaque. It looked to me like hunters posing with the prey. And that went viral and within their closed social network, back to the evils of Mark Zuckerberg. And the panel on this night, and part of the reason that Curtis and Tyler came out was in response to that earlier episode. And so this plaque was brought from that river site to campus that night for the panel. And then, as Curtis told me, on the spur of the moment afterward, they felt inspired to pick it up, carry it all the way from across campus, and pose with it. Susie has some great pictures. This is one, but then she's also got some of them, once they're there, they stood and posed with it. It was a really powerful, silent protest of the kind that are celebrated in this building. So the sign keeps changing. There is an Emmett Till Memorial Association. Another rhetorician, Dave Tell, has written about it and does some work with them. It's a great group. And they sponsor panels and do all sorts of reconciliation work. I would encourage you to check out the Emmett Till Association on the internet. The signs keep getting damaged, so one of the things they need to do is continually raise money for new signs. And that's something that's a real concrete step that we can take. Yes?
I thought there had been cameras put up, which to me would make a lot of sense. And then you wouldn't have to keep replacing the sign. But cameras, you could arrest the people.
That's happened. Have y'all seen that? But then they got some video of vandals and yeah. Bulletproof. I think the new sign is supposed to be bulletproof. Is there a bus? We could drive up there and see it. That'd be a fun field trip.
One more here.
I got another question about critical race theory. The election last night in Virginia, one of the journalists said that they weren't teaching critical race theory in the high schools, but everybody thought they were, and so that swayed the election. But however, if they were teaching it at half the universities, or say if half the pulpits were had that kind of rhetoric about, America, wouldn't it be, how long does that take for it to get into the schools?
So, yeah, I think this is a really, as we think about rhetoric and words and symbols and arguments, this one's fascinating to me, and I'm trying to keep up with it. I watched on Fox News, Laura Ingraham has a program. Anybody watched Laura Ingraham? And so I'm not a regular viewer, but she filmed an episode on our campus the other day, and I watched it. And this was one of the hot button issues. She kept talking about it, and it definitely probably works to anger some segment of the electorate and motivate them to come to the polls. In my book, what I'm interested in, I consider myself an incredibly patriotic person, and one argument that I make is that we need to think about the division within our country and how these words and symbols can divide us for patriotic reasons. And here's I don't know if you can see it, but I put together a collection of Old South Confederate Rhetoric memes that were shared on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and that got millions of likes and comments. And this was, these have been collected by journalists and scholars, some of whom are at Clemson University, before they disappear, because things can disappear so quickly online. But remember the stories about the Russian agency that was putting out false information, misinformation, and disinformation into the social media sphere? Well, they were using Old South words and symbols. And so these are memes of Confederate flags that say things like, "Take back our heritage," or "Heritage, not hate," or, I'm going to say this and bleep me out later because I am afraid my mother's watching, "Kiss my rebel ass," with a big Confederate flag. These memes were created in St. Petersburg and posted under as false names, false accounts made to look like Americans, to stoke dissent and argument. And the scholars who research in this area are screaming at us, this was not just about the election. This was happening before the election, and this kind of misinformation, disinformation from enemies of our country like Russia are happening even now. So, to me, this critical race theory hot button issue is a bit of a distraction.
Yes. Thank you. This is my mind is kind of wandering here. This is a long question, but I just need to get it out.
Sure.
As an African American. Okay. I hear, my thoughts are that generally history is about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you have to be able to discuss all of that. You cannot just lean toward the good and leave out the other parts that are ugly, okay? And yet, it seems that that's a big problem when it comes to discussions about symbols and rhetoric. The most common comment that I've heard about, for instance, when we were dealing with the state flag and the Confederate flag, the most common comment that I heard from whites is that this represents our heritage. And I think there has to be some good part of the heritage that they're talking about, but I guess I just don't know all of that good part that they're talking about, because the heritage that I know, that flag and the times that it represented, the heritage that I know was about a rallying call to lynch people, and in particular to lynch black people, not for any real good reason, just because. And it's like and not only that, but the critical race theory. I mean, there are things that need to be said. I mean, there were ugly things that happened in this country. I can't ignore them. I don't understand how whites would simply, and I realize it's not all whites, but I don't understand how whites can simply say, oh, we just don't want to talk about that. Right. Well, my ancestors didn't want to talk about that. My ancestors didn't want to live through that, but we did. We had to, no other choice. There are times, and I'm going to move this along, there are times that I ask some of my white friends, where is your civil rights museum? Where is it? I mean, why is it that everything concerning civil rights museum involves minorities. And in particular, in the South, it involves Black people. Why is that? You know, and I'm just going to, just closing, I just want to say that rhetoric, I understand, moves people to action, okay? The symbols that we see moves people to action, but as minorities, okay, not a part of the major group, okay, as minorities, we know that when people are moved to action, they do horrible, horrible things. Nobody wants to, seems to want to talk about that. And yet it is very real. And it is very offensive for, you know, when I think about the critical race theory, it's very offensive to think that someone wants to say, oh, well, let's just not acknowledge that. Let's not acknowledge that these horrible things happen. That's offensive.
Yes, ma'am.
And let's move on from it as a state. And I'm a native Mississippian. And I love this new flag that we have. I would love to have flown the state flag at my house years and years ago, but I could not because of the flag and because of what it represents to people like myself. I don't understand why other people don't understand that. Okay, thank you.
Amen. That's.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
I think that I'm following a bit from what she's saying. We have the reaction to the 1619 program, and it's come up with the 1776 program, which our past governor was part of the group that got together to talk about their 1776, which basically kills history. I mean, it takes out most of history and whitewashes it. And my question there is, how do you see that in the rhetoric of the symbols that are on campuses and that remain by campuses?
It's a great example, and it's current. And what I have done, and what I'm thinking I might do with students someday is read both reports side by side, and contain therein are all the arguments that we're talking about, and so I think being willing to be uncomfortable as a white person. So one thing that we too often do is we put the work of anti-racism onto African American people in Mississippi, and so I love this call for those of us who are white people to try to do more, and the 1619 project and the 1776 project, I would say read them together and then make up your own mind. And when I read them together, it was pretty clear which one had great integrity and which one did not. Yep, as just research documents.
Got a question from Dr. Holmes here, but while I'm walking to him, I'm going to read a comment from the live stream, which says, "The bullet-riddled Emmett Till sign is on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington." And has a...
And wouldn't it be great to have it here someday? Yeah.
She mentioned the 1619 project. Hannah Jones, the book is coming out November the 16th. I've already ordered. And a number, butchered with a number of essays. Be very interesting.
Yes, sir.
I'm glad she went to Howard, not UNC.
She was in Jackson last week.
Oh, cool.
Research. Hannah Nicole Jones was in Jackson last week doing research and doing interviews.
And I agree. The flag example is a great one. That's a moment when it wasn't perfect, and we had, it took too long, and we went through struggles as a community, as a state. But we retired that old flag for something better. And in the end, there's some dark stories in here, and some, but then. I have hope for the future. I do think words and symbols have great power to divide people and to promote racism, but I also think they have great power to bring people together and promote equality.
If there are no other questions, I want to say that it seems like just over the last week or two, the new nexus of rhetoric in Southern universities is the Susie Altman, New Miss and Ole Miss. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so part of the inspiration for this book was a moment in about 2002 or 2003 on our campus when the great poet Lucille Clifton, who wrote beautiful poems and children's books, I love Lucille Clifton, she came to campus and she gave a talk, and I was there as a graduate student at that time. And she said, she was just starting off kind of playing, you know how poets play with words? She said, well, Ole Miss. I guess I'm happy to be here. I'd rather be at New Miss. But I guess it's okay to be at Ole Miss. And the crowd, you know how we're chuckling now, the crowd then was kind of like, huh? And even for me, I had not at that time considered the term beyond anything other than a nickname, shorthand for Old Mississippi. It was kind of an electrifying moment, and it took years, but this is what came from that moment. So the term New Miss has been out there, and I haven't. In the last week, I've been teaching and doing things like this. So I haven't dug in, but I can't wait to learn about the controversy because Chris is right. Just in the last week, there's been a documented controversy over the term. Yeah. And I think even lawyers are involved. So that's when it gets really interesting.
Thank you all for being with us today. Don't forget our Veterans Day program next Wednesday. Come back for History's Lunch as well. We have copies of Stephen's book, Heritage and Hate, Old South Rhetoric at Southern Universities for sale over here. He'll be glad to sign a copy for you. Thank you all for being with us. Help me thank Stephen Monroe for this terrific program.
Thanks.